to the integer program, the cash flow matching at the pension fund. But I also want to do kind of a review of the homework, okay? So, and then we'll wrap up with the optimization part of the course by doing some multi-period optimization models. Okay, so let's talk about kind of the Shelby shelving case, okay? So what I want you to see here is that with the Shelby shelving, the model, when I was solving this problem, I literally took the P-pads and I copied it into another sheet, and then I just changed the names and updated the data, okay? I think that the more important kind of insight, that the one insight I want you to take out of this, right, is that when one is making operational decisions, one should not include fixed costs, okay? And so there were several people that were in my office, and we talked about, and I think the best example that I can give you is if you have bought a car since you started graduate school and you have a payment, you have to pay $500 every month to pay off your car, okay? On any given day, you are trying to decide how to get to campus, and you have to decide, you know, do I take the train or do I take my car, okay? Most people, I think, will agree that the decision of which to take, whether you ride your car or take the train, may be influenced by the weather, it may be influenced by how much flexibility you need that day, but no one sits back and says, oh, I have my car payment and that somehow affects my operational decision, okay? You still need to account for the fact that you pay for the car, and you do that when you're doing your budget for the month, or you're kind of balancing your checking account. You account for that payment, but it's not part of your operational decision, okay? And one of the things that you can see here, okay, is that, I think I have it here. I didn't. One of the things that we can see, where do they have it? On the accounting data, here it is, okay? So what I want you to see is that kind of the reason why we don't want to allocate overhead is I'm showing you here how many units I'm going to produce of product S, okay? And this is the overhead allocation. This is what they were proposing we calculate, right? So they're basically saying, listen, if you are going to use, 15% of my production capacity, then you are responsible for paying for 15% of that cost, okay? And if we do that, what you can see here, okay, is that if I'm producing very little and I do that, it puts an undue burden. But the reality is that we are gonna pay for the fixed cost no matter what, whether we produce 1 unit or we produce the 1900. And so when we're making the decision, we shouldn't include it, okay? You could solve this problem as a nonlinear optimization. So if you used the overhead allocation and tried to solve it, solver would have balked at you and said, wait a minute, you're asking me to solve it, but it's not linear. And I can solve it because this curve is very well behaved, right? It's a very easy curve to find kind of the sweet spot here on what you need to produce. But that misses the point. First of all, there are two issues with that, right? One is that you don't get sensitivity reports if you get the Lagrangian relaxation, but this is not as useful for us managerially. And then more importantly, it kind of fails to capture. So why do they do this? So cost accounting is really important, okay? Cost accounting is what folks do to measure the efficiency of different processes within an organization. So it's a great way to say we have this particular process, it is responsible for this output, this portion of our revenues, and this is what it costs to run that department. And we can get a measure of how efficient each department is. And that there is a role for cost accounting, but it's not at making operational decisions. So you can do cost accounting afterwards. You can say, okay, we've made a decision, now we've allocated, now we can see what part of the costs are being should be absorbed by this department when we're doing the accounting, when we're doing the books. But it should not be used for kind of an operational purpose. Okay, are we okay with that? Any questions on the case? Okay, let me go over the sensitivity analysis because I think we did that very quickly the last time, and I want to make sure that you understand kind of what's happening. Any questions on the case so far?
Is overhead another term for fixed cost?
It's another term for fixed. So when you, it's exactly another term for fixed cost. And in fact, right here, right, it says fixed cost, and then here they're doing the overhead allocation. And that's the term that's used. Okay, so here's the sensitivity report. Okay, and so let's talk about how to read this, right? So one of the questions that they asked was, okay, you could get additional resources for either of assembly capacity, or you can get additional resources for kind of processing, forming, and stamping. And to do that, it's going to cost you $200. Okay, should you do it? And so a couple things on the bottom where we have the constraints. Okay, the first thing that we note, right, is that for stamping we only use 765 hours. Okay, but we had available 800 hours. So what we know is that we are not using all of our capacity. We have a slack of 35. Okay, so we could even decrease what we have available by 35 and still not have the solution change. And the shadow price is the value of having an additional unit of resource. And it says here that there is no value. The value of getting an additional hour of stamping is 0 because we're not even using all that we have. Okay? And similarly for assembly, we could assemble as many as 1,400 units. We are only assembling 650, so the shadow price is 0. There is no value in having additional assembly capacity because we are not using 750 of the ones that we have available. Are folks okay with that? So then the next question was, if you could purchase additional capacity for $200 an hour, would you do it? And if so, what would be candidates for doing this? And so we look at the shadow prices and we say, well, you know, I wouldn't want to pay $200 to get an additional unit of Model S assembly because the benefit to my profit is only $137.50. Okay, but I would want additional forming hours. Okay, because each additional forming hour increases my profit by $490. Okay, so what we say here is that for forming, right, what's going to happen is that the benefit of it is going to be $490, which is what we have, minus the 200. Oh, this is not minus the 200 that they're offering. So this is for what is going on? Oh, because I put the per hour. Yeah. Sorry. So it'll be 490 minus 200. That's the benefit per hour. Okay, and I can do this up to 58.3 hours. So if they say, if you want to do this, you want to buy 10 additional hours. Yes, I do want to buy 10 additional hours. And so for each hour that I purchase, my increase in profit is going to be $290. Are we okay with that? Okay. The next questions that they asked was, what would happen if my cost for producing Model S went up by $100? In other words, what would happen if this dropped to $160? Okay, so here it says, look, this is already more profitable. You can increase as much as you want, and it doesn't change the solution. That's what this means. It's an infinite allowable increase, and it says you can decrease it by up to $137. Because it's asking for a $100 decrease, then we know that our we can do that and the solution will still be the same, but our profit will be lower. Our profit will drop by how much? If we do this, it's going to drop by $100 for each unit, and we're still gonna be producing the 1,900 units. So our profit is gonna drop by $190, $190,000, even though we're still gonna be producing the same amount, okay? The next question in the case was, what happens if the revenue from model LX goes up effectively by $300? And so that would increase our objective function by the coefficient by $300. And so here we say we don't know. We know the solution is going to change, okay, because the maximum increase allowed in the coefficient without changing the solution is 275. And because you're saying that it's going to increase by 300, I know that the solution is going to change. I'm not exactly sure how. And the only way that I can find out is by coming here and saying 2,400 and then saying, go ahead and please resolve the model. And saying, okay, so what happened? Why not? Did they change it?
The profit is
I think that's right.
Yeah, it changed,
Yeah.
okay, because before we were producing 1,900 and 400, right? But now it's kind of switched because we have more profit there, okay? So, but that, we wouldn't know that unless we resolve the model, okay? All right, any other questions on this? So now let's talk about the red brand canners, okay? So one of the things that I thought was really interesting is that for the folks who came to talk to me, there were several issues that I think were at play. So one of the things that I want you to keep in mind, as I said before, is that this class is really not about kind of helping you become experts in optimization. And so if you walk away from that first case saying, you know, as I move forward and I make decisions in my life, fixed costs don't affect operational decisions. I need to account for them, but I shouldn't be allocating them as I make decisions. Okay, that's the big managerial takeaway. The other managerial takeaway from that case is that the model aside, you need to know how to read that sensitivity report, because as a manager, you know, your job is to remove constraints from whatever kind of process, whether you are running a marketing department, whether you're running an operational or like a manufacturing, you're running a kind of a group of people. Your job as a manager is to take away constraints, and that means figuring out, if I have a constraint, what should I do to remove the constraint? Okay, and so the sensitivity report says, here, these are the constraints, and you may not have run the model. You may have had someone else do the model for you. They come back and they say, this is the solution. And then you say, okay, so where are my constraints? Where can I get the biggest bang for my buck? And that's looking at the shadow price and saying, this is, if I'm going to make any decisions, this is where the benefit is going to be. Okay. Also, let me make one kind of technical note, which is with the sensitivity report, the changes are what's called ceteris paribus, right? So in Latin, it means like all other things remaining the same. And so it's not saying that if you get more forming and more Model S, you're gonna get 490 and 137. It is saying, if I leave everything else the same and I get one more hour, I will make an additional 490, okay? Or all other things the same, if I add more assembly capacity for Model S, I will make 137.50 more in profit. Okay, those are the key, so it's all other things staying the same. So it's one at a time, okay? When I say if my cost increases by $100, that is going to be all other things staying the same. Are we okay with that? Okay, but that's the biggest managerial. Okay, so in this case, if you had done the first case and had kind of engaged with me, I would have probably said to you, do not do allocation of overhead. So by this point, when you look at this case, you say, all right, they give this data with the price, the variable cost, the contribution, the margin, and then they have the overhead. And so you knew that that part of the table you can leave off because you just need to worry about the contribution margin. Okay. So, this case is identical in many ways to the Make Me Wine and Make Me Wealthy too. Instead of Cabernet and Merlot, we have grade A and grade B, and instead of the Reserva and the house, we have canned juice and tomato paste for sale. But the structure of the model is exactly the same. Okay, so we buy the tomatoes, and whatever we use has to be less than what's available. So there was one small trick here, which is that we are using tomatoes in pounds, but then we have to transform what is the total weight of the product once it gets packaged into cases, okay? And this needs to be less than or equal to the demand that we have. And so the one difference here in this case is that we have quality constraints, okay? So we are basically being told that for however many pounds we produce of canned tomatoes, they have to have a quality of 8. And so when folks came in, we said, okay, whatever pounds I use of tomato, for every pound that I put into my cans, I'm going to get 9 quality points out of it, okay? For every, however many pounds of B grade tomatoes I put into my canned tomato mix, I'm going to get 5 quality points associated with it, okay? And so this is kind of the total quality that I have for this mix. And so if I divide this by the total weight that of tomatoes that I put in, right, they're telling me that this average needs to be greater than or equal to 8. That's what they say. Okay? And so, but this is not linear. Like, depending on what these values are, an increase of 1, can lead to kind of this ratio to kind of move in a non-linear way. And so if you had this in your optimization model, Excel should have kind of balked at you and said you have a non-linear model, okay? So the way that to linearize this is just to say, okay, so 9A pounds plus 5B pounds has to be greater than or equal to 8 times 8 pounds plus B pounds. So just kind of move this over. Okay, and this is very similar to the constraint that we had in class, right? Which was what we had in class was that we needed to have 75% of what we did for Cabernet and Merlot, right? That the amount in Cabernet needed to be more than 75% of the total. That's what we did in class the last time. But if you rewrite this, right, it says, okay, what I have in Cabernet over what's Cabernet has to be greater than or equal to 75%. But this is not linear, so that's why last time we moved this over. Okay? All right. So once you solve the model, which is exactly, has the same constraints as the Make Me Wine and Wealthy 2, we want to maximize our profit by changing how much of each of the 2 types of tomatoes go into the products we're selling, subject to we cannot sell more than is demanded, okay? We have to meet the quality constraints, the quality point constraints, and we have to use less than what's available. And so we solve and we get the model, okay? The difference between this and when the tomatoes cost is fixed, okay, is that when the tomato cost is fixed, so take a look here. So the solution, the optimal solution when we are just buying what we need, we have available 2.4 million pounds of tomatoes to buy. But at Optimality, we only buy 2.2 million, okay? In the second model, we are basically forcing the grower, the producer, to buy the full 3 million, okay? So of course you expect that the solution won't be as good, because when he had the choice of picking and choosing, he didn't buy everything. So by forcing him, the new solution is going to say, okay, I have it, I pay the fixed cost, I'll figure out how to use it, but I'm not gonna do as well. Okay, so here we are. Of course, the caveat there is that, you know, if the discount for buying up front was significant enough, you might be better off. But here the discount wasn't significant enough, right? So it's not a truism that you're always better off, but in this particular case, the discount. So here notice that in the optimal solution with the fixed case, we are now using everything. So we are making some juice, but our profit is going to be lower than when we had a choice of what to produce. Okay, all right, let's talk about, I don't know, why don't I have my sensitivity report? Let me run this and show you the sensitivity report. I'm gonna do it for the fixed cost one, okay? So, I'm gonna solve the model and get a sensitivity report. Here it is, okay. And so what is important here, okay, is that the main question that was asked in the second part of the case was, what would happen? So notice, right, that here we are using everything that we have, okay, but now we are told, hey, listen, you could actually buy additional grade A tomatoes, okay? So what would you do? And we know that even in the model where we didn't have the constraint to have the fixed purchase, we were buying as much of the grade A tomatoes as we could buy. And so the question becomes, okay, in this fixed cost model, what if you had the option to buy additional grade A tomatoes? Should you take them up on it? And so how do we find that information?
Allowable increase for grade A.
So first we need to say, okay, grade A tomatoes, the quantity of grade A tomatoes, that is a constraint, okay? And so first thing we need to do is, if we looked at the answer report, we would see that that is a binding constraint, okay? So we're looking here at the grade A tomatoes, okay? And it's telling us, okay, in the shadow price, that the shadow price of the grade A tomatoes, okay, it is a little bit over 9 cents, okay? So when they tell you you could buy additional grade A tomatoes for 8.5 cents, you say, okay, immediately I know that I want to do it, because for every pound additional, I'm gonna make 9 cents in profit, but it's only gonna cost me 8.5, okay? And it says, and you say, how much can I get? And it says here that, this benefit is up to 600,000 pounds, but they're only offering you 80,000 pounds, okay? So we say to ourselves, okay, so what would be the benefit? So the benefit of buying the additional tomatoes, the benefit, I put on the back today, was going to be that I'm going to make this 9 cents, but I have to pay for the tomatoes, so it's 8.5 cents, okay? And I'm going to do this because the allowable increase is 600,000. I'm basically gonna buy kind of the full 80,000 pounds that they're willing to sell me, okay? And so this says that the benefit of buying the additional tomatoes to my profit function is gonna be $426, okay? We could also have done this by just having added grade A tomatoes to our objective, because now the additional grade A, they have a different cost. So we can't just increase this to 680, but we have to ask ourselves, if I have 80,000 of additional grade A, how would I use it? This becomes part of the decision variable, okay? And the things that have to change now is that our quality points are now also, we're getting an additional 9 points from any grade A tomatoes that we use here into the canned soup, or whatever, the canned tomatoes, okay? And what I want you to see here, okay, is that when I compare the new objective function with the old objective function, guess what the difference is? Okay, it is exactly what we found when we looked at the sensitivity report. 426.67. Okay, so we didn't have to rerun the optimization, but if we did, we would find exactly the same amount, the same benefit. Okay? All right, questions? So what might I ask you in an exam? So in an exam, I may give you a sensitivity report, and I may ask you questions, and you don't have to know anything about the problem, but you need to be able to interpret the sensitivity report. What if I can increase this resource by, should I pay to get more of this resource? What if my objective function, my revenue, my coefficient changes by this much? Will it change the solution? Okay, so those are the types of questions that you should be comfortable answering, and if you don't, you need to come and see me, okay? All right. Okay, so now we're going to talk about, finish the model from last time, the cash flow management problem, and then we'll talk about some multi-period optimization. I hope you guys read the cases, but I suspect you probably didn't, so I might give you a little bit of time to skim the cases. Okay, so let's go ahead and open up the worksheet with the cash flow management as a pension fund. Okay. So what are the decisions? So, okay, so a few of you were running late. I'm gonna have an optional review session on Saturday, the 23rd, from 9 to 11:30, because otherwise we're gonna meet on the 21st, and then we just have our exam on the 5th, and there will be no other time. People are welcome to come. You know, now that I think about it, let me open this up. Okay, different separate questions. Should we do the review on the 30th? I'm not sure, or is the 23rd better? I'm just trying.
Not the 30th.
Not
It's
the
a long
30th?
weekend.
Oh, it's a long weekend?
It's a Thanksgiving.
Oh, because people are gonna travel, yes, okay, all right, so then I guess maybe that's what I was thinking when I picked the 23rd. All right, so let's talk about, the cash flow management at a pension fund here. So, in this particular case, you have, the manager at the city of Evanston, or the manager of a small city, and he has some pension fund obligations. So he has to pay the teachers, the firefighters, and the policemen, okay, and he has to run the city. And for each year that you see in row 11, it shows kind of how much money he needs to basically run the city, okay? And so he wants to know, he has some reserves for the city, and he wants to use those reserves to kind of invest the money in some pretty safe bonds, okay? And what he wants to do is invest the money so that when each year comes, the output from the bonds, the kind of the disbursement from the bonds from that year, allow him to cover kind of his cash flow, his cash outflow. Are we okay with that? Mm-hmm. Okay. So, what is our decision? What is our decision?
How much to invest?
Which to invest?
So remember, right, so he's trying, these are the bonds that he has, and so maybe you're trying to say the same thing, but the decision is not how much to invest, but what? how many of each of the kinds of bond to purchase. I know that's what you meant, but it's, you know, kind of the number, of each type of bond to purchase. Can you purchase a fractional, bond? Can you buy 3/4 of a bond? No, so this is a little bit different problem. This is going to be, we're gonna have kind of integer constraints, okay? We're gonna say those choices have to be integer. So the minute that you move away from a linear program to integer or binary or nonlinear, you lose the sensitivity report, okay? All right, so this is our decision, the number, how many of each type of bond to purchase. What are, any constraints? We need to meet the cash outflow, right? So we need to, the generated, cash flow from our bonds needs to at least meet the required outflow. Okay, so that's as simple as this. And what is our objective? What is our objective?
The same thing, isn't it, though?
So if I was the city manager and I was willing to spend $1 trillion, could I meet my cash flow? Pretty much, I'm pretty sure, for that $1 trillion, no matter what bond I pay, right? So, we are trying to make this decision. It's the first time we're observing one where we have to kind of minimize kind of our total investment dollars. So he has a reserve and he wants to use money from that reserve, but he wants to do it kind of as efficiently as possible, okay? So we want to minimize kind of the total investment amount. We wanna do this as efficiently as possible. Are we okay with that? Okay. So let's start. I'm gonna recopy, the bond, the name of the bonds here. Okay, and so I have the different bonds, and, I'm going to look at the different years. Oh, you know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna do the different years here. Okay, and then, I know that each of these bonds are going to have some outlay, some cash flow outlay. Are we okay with that or no? Okay, so, what is going to be, let's review. If I have a bond with a face value of 1,000 and a coupon, rate of 10% and a maturity of 5 years, what am I going to get at the end of year 1 from this bond? 100, because I just get the face value times the coupon rate, okay? And the same for year 2, for year 3, for year 4, but then in year 5, what do I get? I get the coupon rate plus the face value. Right, so the face value plus the face value times the coupon rate. That's how bonds work. Yeah? Okay, so, I'm going to do this and I'm gonna say, so in year 1, so let's think about this. So I have my setup. I'm going to just copy this. So in each year, this is very similar to the projects. Remember how in the projects we summed what the cash flows that were gonna come in from each of the projects? So here we're gonna do the same thing. We're gonna say, this is going to be our annual cash kind of inflow from the bonds. okay, and this is gonna be millions of dollars. And we know that we want whatever our annual inflow is to be what? So to be, I just copied this, and in fact, I can delete that, so I just moved this over. It has to at least, right, it has to be greater than or equal to what we need for our outflows. Are folks okay with that, or no?
Yes.
Okay, all right. So let's write out the cash flow. So what am I going to, let me give you a minute to catch up. Are folks with me or no?
Yes.
No?
Yes.
Okay. So what am I going to get from Coca-Cola the first year?
Right.
What is the maturity of Coke?
1 year.
So this is the year. I buy it and I immediately get,
1,000 plus 6%.
I have
in-
the 6%, right?
Yeah.
I get the face value here. I'm gonna get the face value, times, itself, cause I'm gonna get the face value, plus I'm going to get the 6% coupon rate. Yeah? Okay. What about for the city of Evanston? What is the cash flow for it in year one?
800.
What am I going to get?
800 and 7%.
Say, I'm sorry, I just can't hear you.
You're gonna get
$70, that's all. And in fact, you know, just to make kind of so I'm gonna get this, the cash flow times, and notice what I'm doing here. I'm gonna lock just the E5 because it's gonna allow me to kind of pull things down. Yeah? Are folks with me or no?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and so I know that because the state of Illinois, Bank of America, and United have also maturity dates that are more than 1 year, I know that I'm going to get just the amount that comes from the coupon rate for each of these. Okay, so let me make sure everybody's okay with that. I said for City of Evanston, because the maturity date is 2 years, I'm going to get 1,000, and watch, please do this for me. Take a look, please, take a look. I want you to also lock the B on the 5, because it'll make life easier for us in just a second. Are folks okay with that or no? Yes or no? Okay, so I know that for all of the other bond issuers, that's what I'm going to get. What am I going to get in year 2 in terms of City of Evanston?
1,000 plus
1,000 plus the coupon rate, which is $1,070. Yeah? Okay, so now what I know is that for the state of Illinois and Bank of America, for the first kind of 3 years, oh no, for the next, so for for state of Illinois, I'm going to get that. For Bank of America, for the first 3 years, I'm just gonna get the coupon rates, and same for United. What's going to happen here for year 3? I'm gonna get 1,080. Okay, and in these two right here, I'm going to get 1,090. And 1,000 and, are we okay with this or no? Yes? Okay, so now that we've gotten the cash flow, we can write our decision. Our decision really is, what is the number of bonds that we are going to purchase, okay? For each kind of bond that is available to us. So this is going to be our decision. How many of each of these kinds of bonds should we get? Okay, so if I choose, 10, 100, and, 5 and 500 and 1,000 bonds, this is gonna generate some cash flow for me. Yes or no? Okay. How do I get the annual cash flow that the bonds are gonna generate?
It's on the sum.
Is it just the sum? What if I buy 2 of the Coca-Cola bonds? How much am I going to get?
Of some product.
Okay, some product, okay. So some product of however many bonds the cash flow from the bonds from that year times the number of bonds. But I need to lock this second part because that's always the case. I'm always multiplying the cash flow in any given year by the number of bonds that I've purchased. Are folks okay with that? So now, take a look at what's happened here, okay? So, do you see how, this is not in millions, but this is in regular dollars? How do I convert this so that it's in millions? What do I do? How do I convert if I have this and I wanna convert it to just this? What do I do?
Divided by a
Yeah.
So decimal point.
I divide it by 1,000,000, yeah? So I'm gonna do this, that, I'm gonna say divided by 10 to the 6, that's 1,000,000. So then instead of having it in full dollars, so watch, if I buy 20,000 of these bonds, I'm gonna have 21 million is my cash flow. Do you guys see that? So again, this is just the sum product divided by 1,000,000, which is 10 to the 6. Billion is 10 to the 9. Are we okay with this? Okay. So notice that if I have no bonds, I have no cash flow. If I have one bond, it doesn't register, cause I just have 1,060. But if I buy 100,000, of these bonds, then it's gonna generate $166 million in cash. Are we okay with this? Okay, so now, what is my total investment? What is my total investment in millions of dollars? So again, supposing I bought 10,000 of these, 500 of these, 2,500 of those, 25,000 of these, and 35,000 of these, okay? So how do I get my total investment?
Current price into some product of current price and number of bonds.
So the sum product of the current price of these bonds and the number of each of the kinds of bonds that I purchased, okay? Now, this is also giving it to me in regular dollars, right? So if I want to be consistent, I need to once again divide by 10 to the 6 to get this in millions of dollars. Are folks okay with this or no? Yeah? Okay. formula, solver. So what do we wanna do? We wanna minimize our total investment, so this is our objective function, by changing what variables? The number of bonds, okay? And then under the constraint that the revenue that we generate each year, okay, has to be greater than or equal to the cash flow outlay. Okay? And then we say, okay, now, notice here, if we go to options, oh, we need another constraint, right? So watch, if I solve this, if I just solve it, okay, it's gonna tell me to buy the bonds in kind of fractional amounts. And so we don't wanna do that. We wanna come back and we wanna say, okay, listen, I need to add an additional constraint, that these values, these variables here, they're gonna be integer. Okay, so the integer, these variables are integer, and then we solve it. Okay, and so that we get that, in order to meet his obligations, he needs to invest $121 million. Okay, we could make this, I think these numbers work out kind of nicely. Yes. So these numbers work out nicely, right? But if we were doing something a little more complex, we might have the ability to take money from 1 year and then invest it and then be available, right? If 1 year you kind of generated more income than you needed, that could be used for fulfilling obligations in subsequent years. So, so we could have some what's called preservation of cash flows built into the model. But this is just a simple model so that you can see what an integer model looks like. Okay? Yes. Alright. Okay, so let's do the following now. I'm going to do one of the next models, which is a little bit, so I think for the homework, I might give you a marketing model so that you can play with it. So where you have to do, the assignment of dollars to different marketing, marketing channels. Thank you, marketing channels. And so I might do that. So I think I may do that as kind of an optional part of the assignment for this week. Okay. Okay. What I'd like to do now is look at the workforce planning at Gulf Airlines. And we'll do this, I don't know if you've had a chance to read it, but if you haven't, maybe take 5 minutes to kind of skim the case, and then I will give you kind of an overview of it if you haven't had a chance to read it. But you have it not as an integer. This one?
The one that we took here.
This is an integer, so the constraint,
Doesn't matter.
it's non-linear, but what matters is that it's integer.
Okay.
So, Okay, so, I guess we asked the question, what kind of a model was the one that we just did? And this is, an integer model. And so, with an integer model, you can think of, the world as being, in a plane where we have just the integer solutions, okay? The way, you don't need to know this for this class, but just so that you understand what's happening. If you were solving the model, what Excel or what a solver usually does is it solves the unconstrained optimization model. It assumes that the values can be anything, okay, that they don't have to be integer. And if it turns out that the solution that it finds to the unconstrained, to the relaxation of the problem is integer, this is great, we are done, okay? If it finds that that solution is not integer, then it says, oh, these are the integer values, but the solution I found is over here, okay? So what it does is it has some rules by which it kind of tries to go to different points and then figure out which solution is better. And it kind of does this using what are called spanning trees, where it kind of, says, oh, because this is in 2 dimensions, it's easy to see, but if you had multiple dimensions, you don't know, if you go this way, you might be missing another point in a different direction. So it goes down a tree, finds the best solution, comes back up, says, oh, let me try this other set of integers, and then eventually it has kind of an iteration criterion that says, either if I've done this many times and I haven't found a better solution, I'm gonna tell you this is the best that I have, or it's going to basically tell you the problem doesn't convert, or whatever it is it's going to do, but that's how it solves these problems. So it's a different way to solve it. And that's why you don't have a sensitivity analysis, because if you're here, you can't just change it a little bit, right? You have to go, there isn't just a little bit of a change. You have to literally kind of skip to a different integer. So there are no okay. Okay. You guys had a chance to look at it? Okay. So, what's happening at Gulf Coast Airlines? What's happening?
He's thinking of more efficiently using the attendants.
The attendants, right? So this is a small airline. They do kind of a few flights. And he's trying to figure out how to do better staffing, okay, for the airline. And so he starts out having some flight attendants already working for him, and he sees that his demand, okay, let's look at his demand here. Do we have the demand? it's in the case, right?
Mhm.
You know what, I'm gonna cheat, I'm gonna come here and I'm gonna find, the number of hours required. So I'm gonna cheat just to put life, makes life easier, okay? So, he sees here that, he has some fluctuation, in the number of flight attendant hours that he needs. And then, but he sees that there's a peak here, but then things kind of drop down again, okay? And so he doesn't wanna have like a whole bunch of flight attendants that can meet the peak demand. He wants to be able to kind of, hire and let go of people as he needs, okay? And so, and what he says here, okay, is that a fully trained flight attendant can fly 160 hours per month, okay, 165 hours, okay? But a new trainee, she has to go through the training, and then, in the next month, that month she can only, sorry, let me make sure I remember this correctly. Well, let me make sure I have this, just because before I say it, I wanna make sure that I have, what I have here. Okay, so just to be clear, so, a flight attendant can be, can work 160 hours a month, okay, 65 hours a month. But for every trainee, that we have training with us, new flight attendant, they use up about 80 hours, of flight attendant's time. So the flight attendants are on the plane, but they have a trainee, they can't be serving coffee, they can't be answering our passenger questions, because they're teaching the flight attendant, the trainee, how to do their job. Are we okay with that? And so over the month that trainee is training, it amounts to about 80 hours. So half of the flight attendants, one flight attendant's time is spent kind of effectively training the new trainee, okay? And the new trainee, for regulatory purposes, can't actually do anything. They don't count as a flight attendant on the flight, okay? So this is just an assumption. Okay, so, let's talk about, what this guy, is trying to do here. So, the decision variables for this model is the first time we're gonna get kind of two sets of decision variables, okay? We're gonna have to decide, the number of flight attendants to hire, okay, at the start of the month. Okay, and the number of flight attendants to fire or to lay off at the start of a month. Okay, so those are our decisions. Our objective here is gonna be to minimize our total labor costs. And we have two sources of labor costs. We have labor costs that are coming from fully trained, okay, and trainee flight attendants. And then we have constraints. So what are constraints that you saw?
Number of time or
So we need to meet, so the number of flight attendant hours available has to at least meet the number of hours required in any given month. Anything else? So they have a union, and so we have kind of constraint on kind of the number of layoffs cannot exceed, has to be less than or equal to, was it 15%?
Yes.
Of, attendance, think it's in the previous month, I'm not sure. I have to read that. Okay, so let's kind of do this. Okay, so I'm gonna move this guy, over, because we're gonna need it. I'm gonna move it down here, and I might need to move it elsewhere. Okay, so let's kind of start here. So we have our decision variables. Okay, and our decision variables are going to be, the number of trainees to hire and the number of attendants to lay off. Okay, so those are our two decisions on any given month. And we have this time horizon. Okay, so here's the deal. Ultimately, we have to figure out, when we are talking about the cost of minimizing our total labor costs, we need to figure out how many people are gonna get, the $4,000 and how many people are going to get the $22,000, okay? So for this reason, I'm being very careful about how I keep track of when the flight attendants are actually in the books, when I can count them as fully trained flight attendants, okay? So I know this is gonna be a little weird, but what I'm gonna do is I'm going to say, okay, what are the number of flight attendants? These are fully trained, okay, flight attendants, attendants available to fly before the hiring. So this is what is tricky, before kind of the hiring and the layoff for that month. Okay, so let me explain what's gonna happen here. So, okay, so let's talk about this. So when we start, right, in January, how many flight attendants does he have in the books? 50. So we know that this is the number of flight attendants he has in the books, it's 50. Yeah? Okay, so now, we need to decide. So this is what we started the month with. Supposing I decide, to hire 2 people and fire none. Okay, so how many people will I have at the start of January?
52.
I'm gonna have 52, right? So I'm going to say, all right, so what I'm gonna have is at the beginning of February, I'm gonna have the 50 that I started with, plus however many I hired in January, they trained in January, okay? And now by the start of February, they're fully vetted flight attendants, minus however many flight attendants I laid off in January. Are we okay with that? So this is effectively what I ended January with. Yes? Okay. And so now if I decided to, if I decided to fire 1 person in February, then I know that in March, I would just have 51. Are we okay with that? Yes or no? Okay. And so if I decided to hire 10 people in April and then fire 5 in May and so forth. Okay, all right. So now, let's continue. So now I need to talk about kind of my objective function, and you will see why this is a nice way to kind of structure this auxiliary variable, which is the number of flight attendants available before. So my objective function is going to be, my objective is gonna be to minimize, okay, I'm gonna say it's gonna be to minimize my total labor costs. Okay, so, what is my total labor cost? And again, I'm gonna copy this. What is my labor cost for January? So let's do this on the board, okay? So, and in fact, take a look at the middle screen. I want you to see, what if I had done 2 and 0, like this, and then 1 and 0, just because it'll be more instructive. Okay, so supposing this is what I did in January, what is going to be my labor cost for January? How many full-time flight attendants am I going to have?
50.
48.
Oh,
I'm gonna
48.
have 48, right? And in fact, let me do this so that it's very clear what's happening, right? So I'm gonna start in January. I'm going to say, all right, I started the month with 50, yes. Then I fired 2 flight attendants. Okay, so for the 48 that I had, I'm going to pay them $4,000 a month, and I need to lock that. Are we okay with that?
Mhm.
Okay. Plus, okay, for the 3 trainees that I hired, okay, I have to pay them $2,000. Are we okay?
Mhm.
Okay, so, and then I can do this for all of the months. Okay. And then I can, calculate, so my total labor cost is going to be what? The sum of my labor costs over all the months. And so in this particular case, it's going to cost me $1.296 million to run the airline with this choice of hirings and firings. Yes or no?
Yes.
Okay, so now we've done our objective, we've written our decision variables, now we need to look at our constraints, okay? So our constraints here are going to be, we said 2 constraints. The first one, that we can do is we can talk about, the number of flight attendant hours that we have available, okay? So number of, flight attendant hours available. Okay, and this is again, gonna be after, right, we do the hirings and layoffs at the beginning of the month. Okay, so, what is that going to be? So in the month of January, how many hours am I going to have?
165 minus 48 into 80.
Okay, so I'm going to have, I had 50 people to start the month, I fired 2, right? And then I'm going to, for each of those people, I would have 165 hours, yeah? So that's for the 48 people. But I have to subtract the time that my attendants or my new trainees are going to use up. And I have 3 trainees, okay? And each of those trainees are gonna require 80 hours of time. Yes or no?
Mhm.
Okay, so, let's just make sure this works, right? So if I hired no one, I would have 48 people times 165, 7,920 hours, okay? But because I hired, in this particular case, 3 people, I'm going to have, and just so that you guys can see, 48, that's the 50 minus the 2 times, the 165, and then I have to subtract 80 hours for each of the 3 people, and that's how I get the 7680. I'm just showing you what the numbers are doing, what the yes? So it's the total number of full-time at 165, and then for each trainee, I lose 80 hours in the month of my flight attendant's time available. Yeah? Okay. So, and then I'm gonna copy this over. And so this is the total number of flight attendant hours, and these are not dollars, but these are actual, hours that we have available. Okay, and the number of hours that I have available have to be greater than or equal to, the number of hours that are required, and we are told that, in the case. These are the number of hours that are required, okay? So notice that in my solution right here, this is not feasible. This choice is not feasible because in firing 2 and hiring 3, I'm gonna be short in terms of the number of hours that I need for the first month, okay? So, okay. All right, so now, let's go to our other constraint, which is the number of layoffs that I can have on any given month, okay? So, the number, are folks with me, or do they need more time?
Mm.
Yeah, okay. So the number of layoffs, is going to be, how do I get the number of layoffs? What cell is that on?
Oh,
B15 for me, oh, no, 16, that's right, B16. So this is just kind of the number of layoffs. I'm just pulling this from my data, from my decisions. These are the decisions I've made, and these are the number of layoffs. And I know that the number of layoffs cannot exceed, they have to be less than or equal to the maximum number of allowable, the maximum number of layoffs allowed. And how do we get the maximum number of layoffs allowed?
it's 15% of what you have.
It's 15%, okay, 15% of what? Oh, I don't wanna do that, you never wanna hard code that. 15% times what?
Before, available before.
The number of people that you started the month with, right? So, yeah? Okay, so can I fire half a person? No, I'd like to, but I can't. Okay, so what function can I use this? So, I think that, I'm gonna use the int function. What does the int function do?
It's integer.
Gives you the closest integer. Okay, so listen, it says, so somebody said round up, and that's not right? Because it said to me that I can lay off at low 7.5. 8 is more than 7.5. So I use int because the int always rounds down. Okay, so I need to be conservative. So then we do this, okay? And that's are we okay? And then we can solve the model. Okay, so we say, all right, let's go ahead and do solver. I want to minimize my total cost subject to changing, these are all incorrect, so you do need to clear it. Changing the number of people that I hire and fire. I'm gonna delete all of these, cause I'm not sure, if they're pointing to the right things. So, what do we know about these variables? Can they be a fractional? Can I
No,
hire
they
a
have to
tenth
be
of a
integer.
person? No, so we're gonna say, listen, I need to add a constraint, oh, that was a mistake. I need to add a constraint that says that the people, the decisions for hiring and firing, they're integer. I cannot, hire and fire a fractional number of people. And then I have my two constraints that are going to be, that I have the number of flight attendant hours available has to exceed greater than or equal to the number of flight attendant hours required. And that, the number of layoffs that I'm allowed to do in any month has to be less than or equal to the 15% upper bound. Okay, so that's my objective function. And I think if you try to solve it with the LP, it's gonna tell you it can't do it. Or it might just switch, let's see. Yeah, it doesn't allow you to do that, so, let's go back. And so I want you to see, you see on the bottom of your screen, it's basically, did you guys see that or no? How it was doing, like it's doing the branch and bound, it's like saying, oh, because these are really hard problems, right? Because you really have, there are all these, it's a kind of almost like this combinatorial optimization. There are many choices that the variables can take, and so it has to do this kind of branch and bound to search traverse the trees to find the best solution. These are very difficult problems to solve in real life, okay? So you can see that it's trying. So sometimes your answer may be slightly off from your neighbor, but it's gonna be off from your neighbor on the neighborhood of like 1%, okay? So, the cost is like $1 million a year. Are you gonna be upset if your answer is, $100 different? It's not a real meaningful difference, okay? But it doesn't, because these are, they're basically doing a heuristic search, you're not guaranteed to get the same exact answer as the person next to you, all right? Okay, so I have a question for you. So we have two choices. There is another model, there's a case, okay? And it is a case where now it's a brewing company, and now we have not one set of decisions. Let me show it to you and then I'll give you the choice, okay? So this model, it's a model where you are making now two sets of decisions. It's a brewing company, and they have to decide, they're trying to maximize, I think they're trying to maximize their profit. Yes, no, minimize the total cost. So they're trying to minimize their total cost, and they have two sources of costs. One is personnel, labor. They have to hire like brewers to make the beer, okay? And then they also have to decide on how much beer to make in order to meet their demand, okay? And here they have a choice of, you can make beer ahead of time and then hold it in stock, just like real breweries do. Okay, so, because there's a setup cost every time you make you know what I mean? So you can hold the beer, you can make more beer this month, because you have the brewers in place, and then you can hold the beer for the next month and use it. And so the constraints that you have are, you gotta meet you can't produce more than your regular capacity, so they have a choice to do overtime. You cannot exceed your overtime capacity, and you have to meet the demand, and then your objective is to minimize the total cost. So here's the option. We can do this model. I wouldn't ask you ever for anything this complicated on an exam, okay? Because I think it requires a lot of moving parts, and we're really doing a survey. There was like with the Excel, we went really deep. This is more of a survey of what you can do in optimization. So we can go through this, or we can begin to talk about, tornado charts, which we kind of skipped, or we can begin to talk about simulation. I'm indifferent in terms of, I think these are all interesting topics, but I'm also kind of feeling like this is interesting, and you have the model posted, you have the case, you can read it. You know that I'm not going to spring this on you on the final, so it's not an issue. But I'm concerned that the semester's coming to an end, and I'm not sure if there is as much value in this as us kind of pursuing a few other things that might be more helpful. So if anybody really wants to do this, we can, but if folks are amenable, maybe we can do something else for the second half. Yeah? Yeah? Okay, so let's do that. I will not test you on this. If you're curious and you wanna look at it and you wanna come and ask me a question, I'm happy to answer it. Okay, but I will not test you on this, on the exam, on this particular model, okay? All right, very good. So why don't we take a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about tornado charts and maybe begin talking a little bit about simulation before we start next week. Okay, so 10 minutes. What we'll do now is actually talk about tornado charts. And also this will give me a chance to talk about the software that we're gonna use for the last couple of weeks of class. It's really great software. You don't have to buy it if you don't want it, but if you do decide to buy the student version, which you get through the class, it's $50, and you get a full working version for a year. So it's kind of a nice piece of software, but you by no means have to get it, okay? The first thing that we're gonna do is talk about tornado charts. And so tornado charts are a really great tool to do sensitivity analysis on a model where you have many different variables, okay? So we are gonna do this with Inspired Endeavors, remember that? And in the Inspired Endeavors, we did what if analysis on what happens if we change the price per unit, what happens if we change the number of units sold, our forecast. But the truth is that when we look at that model, we had many variables. We had kind of the price, the material cost per unit, the manufacturing cost, we had fixed costs, we had salaries. And if we are actually kind of running a company or doing kind of analysis, we may have limited time to know kind of what really matters in this model. And tornado charts do that for us. And so what they are, they're called tornado charts because they look like a tornado. They start wider and they become narrower. And what they do is they do the what if analysis. They vary one variable at a time, and they look at how the varying that variable affects your output measure. So in Inspired Endeavors, we cared about net profit. Remember, that was our net income. And so it's gonna vary each of the variables and look at how it affects net income, and then order the variables to show us which variables have like the lowest and the biggest kind of variance in terms of their impact and profit. Okay, so the way that we're gonna do this, and this is really useful either if you're trying to do market research and you say, I wanna I'm not really sure, what should I be really focused on? So having a model, doing a tornado chart can tell you this is the most important variable. So if you need to be sure about anything, go out and do a focus group or go do some research on this particular variable. So why don't you guys go back to, I don't want to clutter, so go to week 9 and you will see there is an Inspired Endeavors tornado chart. It's like the 3rd or 4th file. Okay. Did you guys find it? Okay, so go ahead and open it. Before you can use Inspired Endeavors, you need to go to the start button on your computer, okay, and search for top rank. So let me show you here. you know what, also, if you have other worksheets open, please close them, other workbooks. And I'll show you why in a minute. So here we are. So I'm gonna go to the start menu and I'm going to search for top rank, and there you should find it. All I did is I typed on the window here and I typed top rank, and I should be able to find it. If you don't find it this way, it's under the Palisades Decision Suites. It's right there, top rank. Did everyone find it? Okay. Alright, so let's talk about what top rank does. Okay, so when you are using top rank, you have to have a model. So to keep us kind of moving, I've already given you the base model for the Inspired Endeavors, which you're all familiar with, okay? So in this, the easiest way to run, oh, you know what, before you go away, when you open top rank, let me do that so that you can see it. Do you see there is a thing here that says guided for? Okay, so don't do it now, but you can go through this, or you can do a quick start. There's an interactive tutorial that you can run that shows you kind of the basics of how top rank works. So it's a really nice way to kind of get exposure to the software, okay? So how does it work? So the simplest way, and this is the way that I'm gonna show you, is that top rank, you can say to it, all right, there is one output that matters in my worksheet. If there are multiple, you would add the multiple outputs, okay? And so let's go ahead and do that. So in our model, we knew that net income, and I've taken the liberty to name everything so that it's easy for us to kind of see what's happening, okay? So when I'm here, I'm going to say, I'm gonna go to the top rank, I'm gonna click on the cell that has my net income, okay, and then I'm gonna click on add output. So can you guys go ahead and do that? So again, click on net income, click on the output, you're gonna get this window, and you can call it net income, or you can call it profit, whatever you wanna call it, and then you click OK. Are we good with that? Yes. Your top rank is not coming up? But you have top rank on the corner, right there.
Yeah, but this top.
And add output. Add output. And not in net.
अपने आप आता है अपने को लिखना पड़ेगा
Maybe if you had already Inspired Endeavors open, maybe it didn't work. But if you close Excel and then open top rank first, everybody got it to work? Okay, all right. So now, once you do this, okay, you can go ahead and click on the analysis settings. So it's right there, okay? So let me explain what's happening. We are going to tell it, this is the output that we care about. Excel then, do you remember how I showed you the trace precedent? Yeah. So it's gonna do that. It's gonna internally say, what are all the cells that go into kind of coming up with this number, okay? And then I'm gonna I'm gonna kind of move those numbers, vary them, and see how this output is affected. That's what is happening, okay? So here's what we're going to do. So everybody click on analysis setting, and there are multiple options. I'm showing you like the most basic option that is the kind of easiest thing to do. So if you go to find inputs, click on the tab that says find inputs, It's at the very top in that box. Do you see it? It's right there. Find inputs, okay? The option that we have here, there's find inputs. We're gonna click when the what if analysis starts. So when you click start what if started, it's gonna go back and figure out what are all the precedents, okay? But notice, right, that for example, we had in this model, we had material cost, right? Material cost per unit. I think it was like, I don't know, $8.10 or something like that. And then we have total material cost. Yeah? Remember that? And it was this times units sold. But when it's doing it, it's only gonna look at the cells that are individual, not cells that have formulas in them, because it looks at just at the parameters and how they are affected. Okay, so that's the next thing, and then we say okay. Actually, let me open mine so that you can see it. So analysis settings, so let me show you. So what's happening here, this is the analysis setting, you guys were just here, okay? If you wanted to do it by hand, then you would, if you wanted to do up front, when the output is added, it would figure out what are the inputs, and it doesn't really matter. But what I want you to see here is that the default is that it's going to take for every input, it's going to vary it by 30% below the base value and 30%, and the distribution is gonna be uniform. So what it's actually going to do for each input, okay, it's gonna say, here's the value. So if this was, whatever the value, so if it was 100, okay, it's gonna go down 30%. I'm just picking a value, right? It's gonna say, okay, and it's going to go 15%, so minus 30, minus 15%, 0, 15%, and plus 30%. So that's what it does. So it takes whatever value, if this is our price, it's gonna vary it in this way, and you can say it, no, I want you to vary it by more or fewer steps, okay? And I want you to use a triangular or a normal distribution. In a triangular, right, a triangular distribution looks like that. And so you can say, this is my value, and I want you to go, more of the values are closer to the actual value, and the others are very far away. So, or this is uniform, the splits are uniform. So there are multiple choices. For all practical purposes, just using the basic uniform is enough for you to see what's happening. Okay. So now, there are 3 ways to run top rank, and it's so easy. So there's 3 ways. There's the automatic way, okay? So what you're going to do is you are just going to say run what if analysis, and that's the end of that, okay? You can do the auto vary function, and this allows you to vary the inputs by different amounts. And so if you have something more sophisticated where you don't want to do everybody by 15% like this, you can go in and have it be, or you can say, you know what, I actually don't want you to find the inputs. I know there are many inputs, but I just want you to consider the inputs that I want you to consider. Okay, so those are the options. But really the easiest way is to run it automatically. So let's go ahead and do it. And by the way, when we are here, again in the analysis setting, I can vary this, right? I can say go as much as 50%, and I don't have to do them evenly in both 30%. I can say go up 50% and go to the bottom just 30%, okay? So these are the choices that you have. Okay, so it's this simple. You set up this is the output. You stay with kind of the basic setup as it is, and then you click run what if analysis. Okay, that's as difficult as it is. Let's go back to here. When you click run what if analysis, it's going to tell you, hey, listen, you wanted, we get that by running. It says you set up one output cell. You said net income is the thing that matters to you in this model. We are going to change all of the inputs, but plus or minus 30%. Okay, we discovered that there are 8 inputs in this model. okay? And so because each of them is gonna be varied in 5 values, we're gonna have to do 40 runs. Do you guys see that? So there are 8 inputs. It found 8 inputs, and we can see here. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Those are 8 distinct inputs, and each one of them is gonna take on 5 values, so it's gotta do 4 what-if runs. Okay, 40, not 4, but 40. Okay, so let's go here, and then it says, okay, I'm going to generate tornado and spider graphs, and that's it, and then we click run. So go ahead and click run. Okay, so when you run, it says, yeah, you know, the reason why the professor asked you to do what-if analysis with the price per unit and units sold is because those are the 2 things that have the biggest impact in kind of the net income, okay? We see here that this is followed by the material cost per unit, and then followed by salary. So the manufacturing cost is really not an issue kind of in this model, okay? So if we're trying to think about ways, yes?
Why can't it take units produced the way you do? I mean, it took everything else.
Why not? Because units produced, that cell is calculated is 105 times units sold. So this is not kind of a, it's dependent on units sold. It's kind of not a primary input, right? It's kind of a composite of another existing. Okay, so let's talk about what else we get. So let's kind of dissect how we got this. So what you see, let me actually go and run mine so that you can see it. Oh, I think I might have auto risk on mine. I'm not sure. Okay. So let's see kind of what it's doing here. Okay, so what it did is it said, look, the base value in this model was 29, okay, and at the kind of the input, at its kind of the input value at its maximum, where I saw the biggest increase in the net income was when the input was 3770, okay. This model is symmetric, it's completely linear. And then the lowest value for the objective was when we set the per unit price at $20, okay? And then it's showing you kind of how, but these are all 30% below and 30% above, right? So, and so you're comparing how would these changes kind of affect you the most. It has also what's called a spider diagram. Have you guys seen the spider diagram before? So spider diagram is showing it to you in percentages. How much has the input changed, okay, and what is the output change on the net income? And so it's saying if I drop the price by 30%, I see a drop I see a drop of 200%. And so it's not a linear, right? So a drop in price really has a big impact. Whereas, for example, a drop of 30% on advertising has next to no impact on the output of the net income. Do you guys see how to read this? And then it does kind of, I don't remember what this is. So, okay. So there are many other things that you can do with top rank. As I said, we can make changes where we say, listen, when we can see the model window. So let me show you the model window. Here's the outputs. So watch what happens. Take a look at the middle screen. If in the analysis setting, I say, no, listen, I want you to find the inputs when I add the outputs, okay, so watch what happens. So this cell right here is right now an output. I'm going to kind of make it back to what it was before, and I'm gonna re-add it as an output, okay? because I re-add it as an output. Now, if I go to the model window, it says, oh, now here are all the inputs that I'm gonna be considering, and this is the changes that I'm gonna be making to them. Okay, so if you wanna see, then you tell it, hey, do it when I add the output, and it creates kind of this mapping of what's happening, okay? So, this is really useful just in general, if you're looking at figuring out what do I need to be more certain of. So if you know that the price per unit is the thing that really drives your model, maybe you ought to do some market research before you present your business plan. And you say, you know what, I know what the market will bear, this is what we think it's going to be, and I know that we're going to be okay with this. All right. When we do simulation, if we are gonna vary parameters, then running a tornado analysis helps us to know which parameters have the biggest impact, and so that we can figure out which ones we need to be really focusing on knowing what distribution goes with it, okay? So I'm gonna give you an assignment this week that has you play with a model for the, you know the little scooters, what are they called? The rental scooters, I forget now, Bird, you know, the Bird scooters? So there was a couple years ago, there was an article that was published on the profitability of the Bird, and I'm gonna give it to you, and I'm gonna ask you to take what the guy created and then create your own version of what he did. What he did is not that great. I did write him and I sent him what I did. He was very nice. He was like, don't bug me. No, he was actually nice. He was like, oh, thank you, this is great. I don't know what he did today. But I'll do that, and you can use tornado charts when you do the analysis for that, okay? I wanna now, because we have half an hour, let me begin to introduce simulation, okay? So I will do this. I have the notes here. You don't have a map, but I think it's important for us to talk about some terminology so that if you are not familiar with it, maybe, by the way, any questions on the tornado charts? So we talked about the model window. So let me actually talk about this very quickly. So notice that when I ran this, now I have this weird thing here that you see how, you see how now it has auto vary, all of this weird stuff here. So if you were to send the sheet to someone who doesn't have top rank, they would all get just pound name. It would not work. And so you can take out the top rank functions by just saying, hey, I want to swap everything out. And now you're back to just the numbers and what you had originally. Okay, so that's what you can do there. Okay, so now let me kind of switch gears here and talk about this. I put this together. And I'll post these in just a minute. As I said, you can, if you decide that you wanna, I don't make any money out of this. I'm just doing this as kind of, so here's the deal. Why Mike? So you have about 2 weeks of a free trial that you can use the software for. So if you really don't wanna buy it, get it with your partner, and one of you can get it for 2 weeks and then the other one gets it, and then it ends the semester. It's fine with me. If you decide to buy, you need to go to this link, and I'll post it next week so you can see it, okay? And it gives you both the top rank and the at risk, and also the decision analysis, and as well as their solver. So there's a lot in that software, but it's really up to you. Okay, so let's talk about simulation. So the idea of simulation started in the 1940s in the Manhattan Project, where the scientists were trying to predict how, how to kind of split the atom, and they were trying to figure out how they could kind of build these cascading nuclear reactions. But the solution to the equations they're just not tractable. You cannot really solve them. And so they decided that they would use simulation to simulate what was happening with the neutron diffusion process. Yes, somebody asking that? So it was kind of a joke. They decided to name it after the gambling, Monte Carlo, the city where there's all the gambling. I don't know why. But that's what it became known as, Monte Carlo simulation. I think I mentioned this to you, but if you haven't read it, there's an incredible book called Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman. Did I mention this to you guys? Okay, so if you wanna be like amazed by a brilliant guy, read this book, Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman. He was like a Jewish kid from the Bronx, and he was brilliant, and he went to Princeton, and it was just like in the 40s or 30s, and it was customary that the wife of the dean would hold like tea every Friday, okay? And so it's a Jewish kid, he's never had like fancy tea, and so he goes to this meeting, and the wife of the dean says, or the chair of the department says, "Oh, Mr. Feynman, would you like some tea?" And he says, "Yes." And so she goes, "Well, would you like lemon or cream or milk?" And he says, "Both." And she says to him, "Surely you're joking, Mr. Feynman." And that's the title of the book. This guy is brilliant. So the best story about him is that, first of all, he used to hold his office hours at strip clubs. He was a professor at Caltech, super funny. He, one time, to make a joke on one of the new professors, a young professor, the professor had said to the students, "You can bring anything." It was introductory physics 101, and the professor said, "You can bring anything you want to the exam as long as you can carry it." Now, Richard Feynman was a really tiny Jewish guy. And so he talks one of the undergraduates. He's a Nobel Prize winning physicist. This is physics 101. And he talks one of the undergraduates into carrying him on his back to the final exam. So yeah, it's a great story. But really, but what is amazing about the book is how insightful he is about learning and about. I'm from Brazil, and so he talks a lot about how in Brazil a lot of the learning is rote. Like I memorized the periodic table. Who's ever heard of? I mean, it's completely useless, right? But in Brazil we do a lot of memorization, a lot. And he talked about when he went to Brazil how a lot of the students really struggled. They really struggled because they memorized the information, but they hadn't really understood it. Like they really, so my son, it drives me crazy. He did, like until third grade, he didn't know the multiplication tables. I'm like, what the hell is wrong with you? Right? But he really talks about how in the US, there's this idea that you can always rediscover, right? You can always rediscover whatever you're learning. And in a lot of countries like Brazil, people really do a lot of rote learning, and it's kind of constrains people from really fully grasping and from fully kind of expanding what they've learned. So it's a really interesting book. Anyways, okay, so why do we care about Monte Carlo simulations? So here is, this is real data, stock returns over the last, 30 years or so. From the S&P 500, and so the stock market has on average had a return of 11.5%, and so that we've done financial functions in Excel, and so if you had been able to invest $10,000 in an account, over the last 35 years, you could today or last year you would have had $3.75 million available for your retirement. Okay, this sounds really, really great. It doesn't sound really great? That sounds really great to me. I moved to like Tahiti. All right, this is the actual distribution of stock market returns over the last 35 years. So we've had some really great years where the return has been as much as close to 40%, but we've had some really bad years. And kind of we can see here in 2008, we had the collapse of the stock market. Also, we had the oil crisis in the 70s here. So we see, okay, so if we actually calculate what your return would be, you would actually have just $2.5 million, okay? So a much, much lower level of return than if you had assumed the average, okay? And so we want to capture, there's certain times, there's certain processes where capturing the uncertainty really allows us to have a better understanding of the impact on our business if we incorporate uncertainty around it. So we've done some what if analysis. We did a lot of stuff with what if analysis to get these ranges if the values change. Okay, so let me talk about how simulation works. Okay, so this is where we started in this class. This is where we've lived. We have a bunch of inputs, Now we've talked about optimization, so now we have decision variables. Okay, so when we started, we only had inputs to the model. That's where we started. Then now we've added these decisions that we can make into our models, and then we look at the output. The way the simulation works, okay, is that we say, hey, listen, some of our inputs, they're not actually kind of known. They're random, they vary, okay? And they vary following some distribution. And often, we're gonna get this distribution from historical data, okay? And so we're gonna draw from the distribution, and I'm gonna do this in a few minutes. So, because I think when I say, like, I'm gonna draw from the distribution, many students have no idea what I'm saying, what that means, okay? So we're gonna get input values that are representative of what we've seen in the past, and we're gonna put them in our model, and we're gonna run the simulation, okay, many different times. And then rather than having one output, the profit that we get is 145,000, we're gonna get a distribution. These are possible outputs that we can have, okay? So let me kind of, what does it mean to sample from a distribution? Okay. When I say I'm going to, if I'm gonna toss a coin, okay, I'm sampling from a distribution. That distribution is called, that distribution, when you flip a coin, okay, it's called the Bernoulli distribution. When you flip a coin, okay, where you have heads and tails, this is called the Bernoulli distribution. And usually when you have the Bernoulli, you have a probability P, okay? So if you give me a fair coin, the P is 50%. And every time I toss a coin. So what does that mean to sample from a distribution? It means that I can do it many different ways. I can do it, in fact, I can just toss it. And I toss it the first time, and I get heads, and I toss it the second time, and I get heads. And I toss it the third time, and I get heads. It's not fair, right? But then I toss it again, and maybe I get tails, okay? Now, supposing I tossed it, I tossed it 10 times. Are you concerned about the fairness of this coin? Probably not, right? You say, listen, you tossed it 10 times. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You got 7 heads and 3 tails. Okay, I toss it again. I may get 6 and 4, right? So when I do the tossing, this number right here is called the number of trials, okay? Sometimes in here, we're gonna call it the number of iterations that we do. Now, if I were to toss this coin 1,000 times, okay, will I get 500 and 500 every time?
No.
No, right? So the idea is that, you know, I'm going to get not always that, but if I were to toss this coin 1,000 times, I'm gonna get a distribution that's gonna be centered with the number of heads that's gonna be centered around 500. But you know, sometimes I may get 501, sometimes I'm getting 498, and a bunch of those times, right? As I toss these coins many times, okay? All right, so let's talk about what do I mean by drawing from a distribution in a bigger sense. So I have it over here, so let me show it to you. Are folks familiar with the normal distribution?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Okay, so let me ask you a question. If I have a normal distribution, okay, and I tell you that if I have a normal distribution, where the mean is 100 and the standard deviation is 30, what is the lowest number that you are likely to see and the highest number that you are likely to see? So I say prices are normally distributed with a mean of $100 and a standard deviation of 30.
70 and 130.
Okay, so if you learn nothing else from this class is that that is the wrong answer. Okay, so this is like, if you go to any job where you have to be a data scientist or a data analyst, you must know that this is the wrong answer. Okay, so a normal distribution, it is a bell curve. It is centered around the mean. Okay, now if you are, what is the probability that you are within one standard deviation of the mean? This probability in here is 68%, okay? The probability that you are within 3 standard deviations, 100 minus 3 times 30, and 100 plus 3 times 30, or 190, okay? This probability right here is 99%. In other words, if I have a standard norm, a normal distribution, it is not unusual for me to see numbers that are within 3 standard deviations, okay? And in fact, if you set this, okay, then it would mean that 32% of the time a number would come out outside of the range. So a third of the time you wouldn't even have predicted. You would have said, you would not even known that a number below or above would have come out. Okay, so in a normal distribution, you can be 99% confident. There is a 99% probability that the numbers that you're going to see are going to be within 3 standard deviations below or 3 standard deviations above. Okay? All right, so what do I mean by sampling? So the normal distribution appears in nature all the time, right? If you look at heights of like populations of heights of men or heights of women, there is kind of a central tendency. There's the average, most people are around that amount. The majority of the population is around the center value, okay? And then there are some people who are really tall and some people who are exceedingly short, okay? But the likelihood of seeing extremely short people or extremely tall people is much lower. Okay, so that's how to read kind of a normal distribution. Okay, so now I am looking at a population and I want to model kind of the height of people. Okay, so basically, I don't know why I would want to do that. I don't know why I would want to do that. Maybe because I'm like building a car and I want to figure out kind of the right height for my door in my car. Okay, and so I want to model kind of the comfort level of people getting in and out, and I want to model the height of people. Okay, so I could just do my model and say the average American man is 5'10" and call it a day. Yes? The problem is that there's variance, and I may want to capture that, okay? So, I want to make sure that folks really kind of understand what I mean by sampling, okay? So I'm trying to think about how, oh, I know how I'm gonna draw it. I'm gonna draw it. Instead of drawing it like this, I'm gonna draw the distribution like that, okay? Where this is like very high, like 190, and this is very low. Okay, are folks okay with that? Okay, so I'm gonna toss a pen, and wherever it hits, that's what I've sampled. That's what I've sampled, okay? So I've sampled, and I think it hit right here. I got that person. I'm gonna sample it again. I don't know. So, but do you see how if I were to throw the pen, I would throw it, and most of the time I would be hitting around the mean, right? I'd be like there, yes? And if I'm always tossing, sometimes I may get up here and but very rarely. So take a look at the middle screen. That's what I've done here. So look at the dot. Oh, no. Okay. Okay. Okay, so do you see the dot? So this is the mean, the average is 100, the standard deviation. Now, it goes, the normal distribution has infinite tails, okay? It's an infinite distribution, but the probabilities, once you get to like down here, they're basically non-existent. 99% of the time, you're gonna be between -3 standard deviation and +3 standard deviations, okay? All right, so take a look at the dot. So this is me throwing much more elegantly than at the wall, okay? So first, so I get that, 140, so I'm throwing, and these are random, right? But notice, right, that for the majority of the time, sometimes I'm in the tails. Notice that in this particular random, I haven't really been on the low tail yet, right? But I've been a couple times in the high tail. But this is truly using kind of a random number generator to figure out where am I going to be in the distribution. Do you guys see that? So now, if I'm looking at, I'm trying to figure out how responsive people are to coupons that I send them, okay? So if I send Kenny a coupon, maybe there is a 3% chance that she opens it. You know, so I may want to say, okay, but what if I send, you know, her like a series of coupons? So I'm gonna send her like a series of coupons, and I'm gonna keep track when I send her the coupons. And I think, you know, maybe Brian might have like a 2%, or Asma might have a 5%, but I have some idea of the percent that people are going to open, okay, I have some belief, and I'm gonna send them a certain number of times, okay, where I believe each time there's a probability that they will open that coupon and maybe make a purchase. So this is actually called the binomial distribution, and I need the number of times and the probability. And so if I send, if I send you 100 times the coupon, and I think that the probability that you will click and use the coupon is 10%, then on average, I expect you to make purchases 10 times, right? That's the expected number of purchases, yeah? So let me show you, so what we're going to do in our models is we're going to, so let me open at risk. You don't need to, I just want you to see what I mean by sampling. So this is at risk, and this is what we're gonna do when we use sampling. Okay, so now remember, I'm gonna do heads, okay? So I'm gonna toss a coin, watch this. Heads, the probability of heads in my coin now is going to be 80%. This is not a fair coin. Do you guys see that? So I'm gonna toss my coin 1,000 times. So watch, so we remember this, right, series. This is a column, and I'm gonna stop 1,000 times, okay? So, I'm gonna do this toss, and in at risk, I'm gonna say, okay, it's gonna be risk, Bernoulli, because that's when you toss a coin, and I'm gonna say this is the probability of seeing a coin, yeah? So now watch. So this is not yet, so watch. So now it says I've tossed the coin, okay? And now every time, this is like me tossing the coin. yeah? And so now I can say, hey, I tossed this coin 1,000 times. How many times did it come up heads? 788. If I do the experiment again, 808. Do you guys see that? Okay, so this is kind of the number of heads. Okay, so in at risk, I can say, oh, you know what, I really would like to see kind of how if I were to do this many, many times, what would be the distribution of heads? Because I know I'm not always gonna get 800. So watch what happens. I'm gonna say, hey, do this for 1,000 times, 1,000 iterations, these tosses, and count these runs of 1,000 and count them. Watch what's gonna happen. Okay, so it says, okay, let me show this. So it says, listen, if you did 1,000 of these little runs of tossing a coin 1,000 times, okay, what you would see is that, look, on the long run average is that you do get 800 heads, okay, but sometimes you get as few as 763, and sometimes you might get as many as 845. Do you guys see how this works? Okay, so now let's talk about the binomial one, right? So what I said was, I'm going to, I'm gonna, the probability that you open the ad and make a purchase, okay, open and purchase, might be just, let's say 2.5%. It's a very low probability, okay? And so every time, this is what I think, and so is there a purchase? Did a purchase occur, right? So what's gonna happen is I'm gonna say, listen, over the time, I'm gonna have a risk binomial, and I wanna know if Adrian purchased. And I know that every time I send him an ad, there's only a 2.5% chance. And so I'm gonna send him, kind of 100 ads in the span of this next couple months, every time he's opening, and each time the chance that he purchases is 2.5%, okay? So it says, all right, so look what's gonna happen, okay? So what this is saying is this, let's see, why is this doing this? Do I want it to be? Okay, so let's make sure that, if I do 100 times 0.025, okay? So, in the span of the time, we expect him to make about 2.5 purchases, right? If I send him 100 times, over in this 100 times, we expect that in 2.5 or 3 out of those times, he's gonna make a purchase, okay? So notice as I'm pressing here, it says, oh, what are the number of purchases? So sometimes he makes a lot of purchases, sometimes he makes no purchases, sometimes he makes one purchase. Do you guys see that? Okay? So now I'm gonna model, and I wanna say, okay, so if that's the likelihood of a purchase, what can I expect to see here? So, and in fact, so what it says is that, look, for the most part, I can expect, him to make about 2.5 purchases. There are, sometimes I get lucky and I get a lot of purchases, but for the most part, I'm gonna be either seeing, 2 or 1 or 3 or 4 or 5 or no purchases, right? So this is so now I can do this, right? So I can watch this. So I have now many customers, okay? So now I have a customer 1, customer 2, right? And maybe the chance of making a purchase is just 1.5%. But now I can think about all my customers, and I can say, okay, it costs me, I don't know, maybe 25 cents to send each of these ads, right? And I know what I can earn from the purchase, from each of the customers. And so does it make sense if I think that the probability of a purchase from an ad is 1.5%? Do you guys see how all of this can begin to kind of drive your models? Because before, all I could do is I would have, you know, number of purchases from a customer. My model would just be number of purchases, and I would say on average I see 2.5 purchases. And then I would build my model using just this number. That's how we've operated. We might do an what if analysis where we say, what if the customer makes no purchase, 1 purchase, 1.5, 2 purchases, right? That's what we might do. But now we can model the behavior across a whole set of customers and look at what would happen if the customers behave differently. Do you guys see how this works? And so the binomial, by the way, all it is a bunch of Bernoullis. So if I toss a coin, right, heads or tails is Bernoulli. If I toss a coin 10 times and I count how many heads, that's the binomial distribution. I wanna know how many successes out of 10 tries, how many purchases out of 100, you know, email kind of ad setup, okay? We'll come back, we'll talk about more of how to do distributions. But do you understand what it means to sample now, to kind of, we have some belief, and we'll come back and we'll talk more about it next time, okay? But the models will become much more rich because we don't have to rely on averages. We can look at actually what are the possible whole range of distribution of what can occur. Okay? All right, so we'll see you next time.
Yep, thank you.